Like, share, comment, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this. When Tom suggested we spend a week at his father's house in the countryside, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for us to visit his dad, Richard, a widower who had taken to a quiet life after retiring. Tom adored him, and I could understand why. Richard was a steady presence, warm and reliable, with a dry sense of humor that always put people at ease. The house itself was a sprawling old place with creaking floors and an overgrown garden that seemed to stretch forever. It was beautiful in a way, but it also felt isolating. Tom and I arrived late in the evening, the kids asleep in the back seat, and Richard greeted us at the door with his usual wide grin and a hearty hug for each of us. "Long drive?" he asked, helping us unload the car. "It wasn't too bad," Tom replied, brushing off the question as he always did. I followed them inside, carrying one of the kids in my arms, and was instantly hit by the warmth of the house. The smell of wood smoke and something faintly citrusy lingered in the air. It was comforting, familiar. The first couple of days were uneventful. Tom spent most of his time out back with Richard working on small projects around the property, while I kept the kids occupied. I didn't mind. It gave me time to read, to relax a little. It wasn't until the third day that I started noticing Richard in a way I hadn't before. I had come downstairs early that morning, hoping to enjoy a quiet cup of coffee before the chaos of the day began. Richard was already there, standing by the window with a mug in hand, looking out over the garden. "Morning," he said, turning to me with a smile. "Morning," I replied, heading for the coffee pot. "You're an early riser," he commented, his tone light. "Not by choice," I said with a small laugh. "It's the only time I get to myself these days." He nodded, and for a moment we stood in companionable silence, sipping our coffee. "You've done a lot with the garden," I said, gesturing to the view outside. He smiled, a little sheepishly. "It keeps me busy, gives me something to focus on." We talked for a while, nothing too personal, just about the house, the garden, little things. But there was something in the way he listened to me, the way his eyes lingered just a little longer than necessary. I told myself I was imagining it. That night, after the kids were in bed and Tom had gone upstairs to read, I found myself in the living room with Richard. We were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, the TV playing softly in the background, though neither of us was paying much attention to it. "You look tired," he said, breaking the silence. I laughed softly. "That obvious, huh?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You work too hard, taking care of everyone. You should let someone take care of you once in a while." I didn't know what to say to that. It was a kind thing to say, but the way he said it, the way he looked at me when he said it, it felt different. I stood up quickly, brushing off his comment with a laugh. "I think I'll head to bed. Good night, Richard." "Good night, Laura," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. As I climbed the stairs, my heart was racing and I couldn't understand why. The next morning, I avoided Richard. It wasn't difficult, not at first. The kids kept me busy, demanding snacks and refereeing their endless squabbles over toys. Tom, oblivious to the growing tension I felt, spent most of the day in the shed with his father, working on some broken lawnmower. I was grateful for the distance. It gave me time to convince myself that I'd overreacted. Richard was kind, attentive, yes, but surely I had read too much into his words, his gaze. He was my father-in-law, for heaven's sake. But that evening after dinner, the tension I'd been trying to ignore found its way back. Tom had fallen asleep on the couch, one arm draped over his face, his chest rising and falling steadily. The kids were upstairs, worn out from an afternoon of running around the garden. I lingered in the kitchen, cleaning up even though the dishes were already spotless, hoping Richard wouldn't come in. Of course, he did. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice teasing as he leaned against the door frame. I turned, startled, and saw him standing there with a glass of wine in his hand. He looked at ease, but there was something in his expression, something watchful, deliberate. "I think I got it all," I replied, forcing a smile. He stepped closer, placing his glass on the counter. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly, his tone more serious now. "I haven't." "Yes, you have." His interruption was gentle but firm. "Did I say something to upset you?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "No, of course not. I've just been busy." He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "Laura," he said, my name falling softly from his lips. "If I've made you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. That was never my intention." His sincerity disarmed me, and for a moment I felt foolish for having built this tension in my head. But then he reached out, his hand brushing mine, and every nerve in my body seemed to light up at once. My voice faltered as I stepped back, but the counter behind me stopped me from going any further. He didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. His presence was overwhelming, the air between us charged with something I couldn't name. "This isn't right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he said, his gaze unwavering, "but I can't help how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My breath caught, and I turned my head, breaking the eye contact that had become too much to bear. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe not," he replied, his tone soft but resolute. "But it's the truth." I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but all I could think about was how close he was, how easy it would be to lean into him, to let myself feel the things I'd been trying so hard to suppress. "Richard," I started, but I didn't know what to say. He stepped back then, giving me space, and the sudden absence of his nearness was like a cold rush of air. "I'm sorry," he said again, though his voice didn't sound sorry at all. "I'll give you some space." Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with the echoes of his words and the pounding of my heart. I stood there for what felt like forever, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to process what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, his gaze, his voice. The following day, I woke up determined to put the incident behind me. I busied myself with the kids, took a long walk through the garden, and did everything I could to avoid being alone with Richard. But the harder I tried to distance myself, the more aware I became of his presence. By evening, it was impossible to ignore. Dinner was quiet, though Tom, oblivious as ever, filled the silence with stories from his childhood. I forced myself to laugh at the right moments, but every time I glanced at Richard, he was already looking at me. It wasn't overt. He was careful, measured, but I felt the pull of his gaze as if it were a physical thing. After dinner, Tom suggested we sit by the fire pit in the backyard. The night was cool and clear, the stars scattered across the sky like salt on a dark tablecloth. I thought the open air and the presence of others would be a relief. But as the night wore on, the kids drifted inside to play a game, and eventually, Tom excused himself to put them to bed. That left me alone with Richard. The fire crackled between us, casting flickering shadows on his face. He sat back in his chair, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, and for a while, neither of us spoke. "I should probably head in," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Stay," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "Just for a little while." I hesitated, the weight of his words holding me in place. Against my better judgment, I sank back into my chair. I don't know what to do with this, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. With what? He asked, though we both knew the answer. This. Whatever this is between us, I said, my words tumbling out before I could stop them. It's not fair to Tom, or the kids, or anyone. No, it's not, he agreed, his voice low and steady. But that doesn't make it any less real. I shook my head, staring into the fire. We can't do this. We haven't done anything, Owen, he said, and there was a hint of a smile in his voice. But it's there, isn't it? This thing between us. I looked up at him then, and the intensity in his eyes took my breath away. Richard, please. I won't cross that line, Hogamo, he said, his tone soft but firm. I would never do that to my son, but don't ask me to pretend I don't feel it. The raw honesty in his voice cut through me, leaving me exposed. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood up abruptly, needing to put distance between us. I should go check on Tom and the kids. Laura, he said, and the way he said my name stopped me in my tracks. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the firelight dancing between us like a living thing. Then he stood, closing the space between us in 2 deliberate steps. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. The air between us was electric, charged, with everything unsaid. I hope you know how remarkable you are, he said quietly, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. And I hope Tom knows it too. The tears I'd been holding back threatened to spill, and I nodded, unable to speak. Then, just as quickly as the moment had begun, it was over. He stepped back, his expression guarded, and gestured toward the house. Good night, Laura, he said, his voice steady as if nothing had happened. Good night, I managed, my voice shaking. I turned and walked back toward the house, my legs trembling beneath me. As I stepped inside, I glanced back and saw him standing there, silhouetted against the firelight, his gaze following me until I closed the door. That night, as I lay in bed next to Tom, I couldn't stop thinking about Richard, his words, his presence, the pull between us that neither of us dared to act on. It was wrong, all of it, but it felt impossibly human. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this.